What's going on, everyone? I'm Zero, and welcome back to Zero Two, where today we've got another meta snapshot for you. Today we're going to go ahead and take a look at all of the top decks that are currently doing well in the current format, look over their deck lists, talk over their card choices, as well as go through some of their spicier techs and options that they're able to play. We'll also go ahead and look over stuff in the side deck, so that way you can be fully prepared for any upcoming events you'd like to go to. Starting off at the top, we've got the best deck, Ryzeal, at the moment. I don't believe anyone has any sort of qualms or questions that this is the best deck. It's seeing most of the best tournament results. The engine is highly compact and consistent, and very frequently people are splashing in the Fiendsmith cards to supplement the full deck itself. It's called Ryzeal, but I would even call this Fiendsmith Ryzeal, given the prevalence of all of the Fiendsmith cards in here. But we've talked about Ryzeal in depth before. We've gone over all of the monsters, so I won't give you a card by card breakdown here. You can go check out other meta snapshots if you've missed that. But looking at the deck list, things that are changing just seem to be mostly the hand trap ratios. Fuolos gaining more popularity. Fuolos plays very well into both this deck and Maliss. So no surprises there that Fuolos is gaining some traction, especially the Fiendsmith variant really struggles to play through Fuolos given how much summoning they do from both the extra deck and the deck. Putting it Requiem can kill us both, for example. Um, and they're cutting down on some of the more niche hand traps, stuff like Ghost Ogre. Their Bestial package is going a lot lower, mainly because Maliss is so good right now that Bestials don't feel as impactful. Being able to hit stuff like the Fiendsmith cards is nice, but for the most part, you would rather not have the Bestials who are essentially dead in the Maliss matchup because they would just give them advantage. As far as rank 4 techs go, because that's probably the most interesting part of the Ryzeal extra deck, we're seeing a new card that just came out in Supreme Darkness getting played called Eclipse Twins. So we'll talk about this card for a little bit. You can Xyz summon this by also treating rank 4 monsters you control as level 4s, but it normally requires 2 level 4s. But you can also make it using your rank 4s. And then you can detach a material from this card to make it attack twice during the battle phase, but that's not super important. The more important part of this card's effect is that if it's sent to the graveyard, you can target 2 other rank 4 or lower Xyz in the graveyard, summon one of them, and attach the other. So this is another way to recycle or recur your detonator if you need to and you've already gone through it, or if it gets outed on your opponent's turn while it has the Eclipse Twins as material. Because again, you can always go ahead and send the Eclipse Twins off of something like an X Ryzeal, and then equip it under the detonator when it's Xyz summoned. So Eclipse Twins is a way to basically give you some extra insulation from removal. If your detonator ever leaves the field, Eclipse Twins can just bring it back. Pretty degenerate stuff, but still a very strong combo that you need to know coming out of Supreme Darkness. Additionally, it looks like some of these decks are on the full armored Utopia Ray Lancer, not a new card. This card's been around for almost a year now, I think, at this point. We can see even there, not quite a year, but closing in on half a year, I suppose. And it's a rank 4 that does require 3 level 4s normally, but you can also just Xyz summon it over top of any of your rank 4s by discarding a spell trap, which is the most common way you're making this. And then at the start of the battle phase, you can negate the effects of all attackers and monsters they control, which is really, really strong. It can make clearing boards a lot easier. And it also gives extra attacks when it destroys a monster by battle. So it is it's kind of an all-in-one battle phase cleanup card that it's not surprising me to seeing some play in the deck. Looking at a recent deck list, just click on this one and take a peek at it. Again, this is the Fiendsmith variant. Not too much to talk about outside of the Eclipse Twins, which is like the big new addition. Well, seeing it a bit from a preview here, and I don't know if it's going to be as prevalent enough to talk about, but Molcharming Meows was also released in Supreme Darkness, and is like the other Molcharmies where you can discard it from your hand as a quick effect to draw cards when your opponent does something. Meows draws you a card whenever your opponent summons a monster from banishment or the graveyard. So this is a very good card into Maliss. It gets you multiple draws off of all of the Maliss monsters summoning themselves back. And then additionally, it can come up against like Fiendsmith. Fiendsmith summons at least like once from the graveyard with the Engraver. And as we just saw, Eclipse Twins now revives from the graveyard as well. So Meows is certainly not a bad option to be playing in the side deck at the moment. A bit pricey, if that's pricing you out of it. It's not an absolute must inclusion by any stretch, but it is still a decent card in this current form. That's Ryzeal. Again, I want to go quick through this. I would like to present all this information in a relatively compact manner. So let's go ahead and jump into Maliss and talk about it quickly as well, because we've already gone over all of the main cards in Maliss. About half of the lists, it seems, are on the Striker variant. About the other half tend to be on like the Bystials or more hand trap heavy. It really just depends here. In fact, looking at trends, we can see that the heavier Bystial engine, i.e. with the Lubellion, is going down in popularity quite a bit. But they are still on a significant number of Bystials like Magnuma, Druis Worm, some are even on Baldrake. Because again, if you're able to banish your Maliss monsters out of their graveyard, you can trigger their special summon back effects to accrue you some extra advantage and keep your combos going. They're still on mostly good Cyber Slink stuff. They're still on the Neo Tempest Terahertz in some lists, but not all lists. Some decks are trying to jam in the Fiendsmith stuff, but as you can see, that's a lot less popular in Maliss as opposed to something like Ryzeal. And if we take a look at this second place list from a recent event, we can see that this is a pretty standard cookie cutter list you would expect to see at any tournaments. Just 3 of the good Malisses, 2 of the Chessy Cat, and a bunch of hand traps alongside the one of those traps. Pretty standard ratios. They were on Packbit, Enigmaster Packbit, which is a pretty cool tech in the deck, as a way to act as removal, or it's a unique piece of removal. It's like putting up a monster in your opponent's spell and trap zone, so it's not destructive, which can be important in certain matchups, especially against the detonator, who is really hard to destroy. But yeah, again, not too much to talk about with Maliss. I wish I had some new cards from the newest set to talk about that synergize well with Maliss, but there really wasn't much that was released in Supreme Darkness that really goes well with them, so they're pretty much playing this standard battery of cards without too much deviation. Again, maybe I can find a Sky Striker list that we can talk about from recent tournaments. Yes, as you can see, they're on basically just 2. There's ones on 2 engage, which is wacky to me. Normally they're on 3 engage with the Hornet Drones, Widow Anchor in there as options. I've seen Shark Cannon be in there as a way to disrupt Grave of Vex and decks, but certainly Engage being a powerhouse in a deck with a decent number of spells, giving you an extra draw, and searching like removal for Detonator or extra link bodies that you can use to extend your plays. Okay, but yeah, so that was Maliss. And moving on, it looks like Tenpai is next on the list, and I'll scroll to make sure that these are real, because it is actually getting some tops. We thought Tenpai was dead when they got rid of the Chandra and the Kaiman, or not got rid of them, put them down to 1. Being massive hits to the deck, but in actuality, it is most certainly not dead by any stretch. Tenpai still has their main OTK combos. They're still able to consistently pull them off. I'd say relatively consistently. For the most part, they're still just really strong going second. And if they do draw into their OTK combo, it's still the same thing. It's just a bit more fragile to interruption and whatnot. They have also been teching in the Fiendsmith cards. Big stunner here, because everything essentially is teching in Fiendsmith nowadays. But the Fiendsmith cards give the deck an option to have a play going first. They're also very good at breaking boards. I mean, Fiendsmith Engraver is a send of a card or monster on the field to the graveyard, which can help with removing problematic boss monsters. It demands an answer. You can set up High Wave King Caesar going first, which can be annoying, in addition to like a Seals. Yeah, pretty crazy stuff that it's able to do. And if we take a look at one of these lists, we'll just take a look at this top 8. We can see that they're on just this massive battery of hand traps that Tenpai's able to play. I mean, the fact that they have 2 fewer Chandra, 2 fewer Kaiman means a whole extra hand trap slot they can play. I mean, they're main decking Phantasme for stuff like Maliss. They've got all the Bystials in there for the other Fiendsmith stuff. The deck can still compete at a high level, so if you threw away your Tenpai core, it might be time to try and dig that out of the trash and see if you can scrounge that back up, because it is still a fairly competent strategy, although you will have to shell out a bit for the Fiendsmith stuff. in my opinion, to make it particularly viable. But outside of that, not too much to talk about. The Tenpai stuff is still Tenpai. You're playing three of the good card that you're able to still play at three, one of all of the rest, either due to necessity or because they're not so great. And then the rest of the deck is just filled out with hand traps and potentially Fiendsmith cards. So, yeah, that's Tenpai. Moving on. The next deck that I'm excited to talk about, because we will actually talk about this one. We'll skip over all the Ryzeal stuff because that's pretty much the same. But the interesting part about this deck is the new Mitsurugi cards. You can see there's a lot of new Mitsurugi labels in here. So we'll get the chance to talk about these cards real quick. Mitsurugi is an archetype of ritual monsters. It's cornerstone by this ritual spell that they have, which basically acts as both advanced ritual art and high ritual art in one card, where basically if you have the ritual monster already in hand, you can use materials from deck, as long as they're reptiles. And if you have the materials in your hand or field, you can ritual summon a ritual monster who's in your deck. So an insane piece of consistency. This card's almost always live, and it allows you, in combination with Mitsurugi prayers with consistency, because this just adds a Mitsurugi monster from deck to hand. So this can get you to your rituals or your Saji or your Mikonoto. But yeah, so Saji on summon, when normal or summon, gets to search a Mitsurugi spell trap, which can be get the ritual, so that way you're off to the races. The Mikoto, if summon, can target a Mitsurugi card in your graveyard, add it back to your hand, so it's extra recursion. And then the two rituals are really strong, so when they're tributed, you get to, with Ameno Mirakamo, I'm going to butcher all these names, by the way, so apologies in advance. But when it's tributed, you get to add a Mitsurugi card from deck to hand, and then special summon it back. So both of these are 8s, and when you tribute one of them to summon the other one gets to come back and give you advantage, because when this one's tributed, it also just adds a Mitsurugi card and then summons itself back. So they both do the same thing. I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to say they both did that. But additionally, they provide some interruption points, like Futsu. If your opponent special summons a monster, you can target a reptile in your grave and revive it, so this gets you extra bodies on board. This can be for the Ameno, because if it's special summoned, you can destroy all monsters your opponent controls, so that can be a quick effect board wipe if it triggers off of the Futsu. And additionally, when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can make it so that it's negated if your opponent doesn't discard a card. So at the best or at the worst, it's a hand rip, and at best, it's a Nomni negate. So super powerful in terms of what it adds to the board, and for relatively low investment. I mean, the Ryzeal stuff already doesn't take up much space. You can see even they're on the Nadir Servant as a way to get extra advantage with the Herald and go into the Mitsurugi cards. They're on Night Sword Serpent, which is a slightly newer card, but definitely not like new. It came out in like 2021. And if it's sent to the graveyard, you just get to revive it. So it's a free level 4 that's a reptile that you can tribute off of the Mitsurugi ritual to get an extra body on board. Do your Ryzeal combos. The engines just synergize very well together. I mean, this Mitsurugi Purification is also a negate that they can search as well. So they have a lot of value that they can offer to the Ryzeal deck. And it's no surprise, this was one of the most hyped archetypes coming out of Supreme Darkness, and so we're excited to see this starting to come into its own. If we take a look at this first place list, we can see that as far as ratios go, it's typically 3 of the Saji, 2 of the Ameno, and then 1 apiece of the Mikoto and Futsu. And then as for the spells, you play 3 of the Ritual. It's like 2 of the Prayers. I could easily see playing 3 of the Prayers. But I guess it's up to personal preference. And then 1 of the Trap as some interruption. It'll be interesting to see this deck develop. Again, these lists are coming out after only really a week of the set being formally released. So I'll be excited to see what else people can do with it. But it is pretty interesting to see. One thing to mention as well that I did skip over, because King of the Feral Imps is a rank 4, you can make it with any of your Ryzeals, and then that can search any of your reptiles, like your your Mitsurugi starter, and then you're back off to the races. So definitely a hyper consistent deck where both sides can kind of bridge into each other, which in my opinion is pretty cool. But yeah, so that's Ryzeal Mitsurugi. It's probably the only new deck we're going to be touching on, since none of the other new stuff from Spring Darkness had too big of an impact outside of, again, Eclipse Twins and the Mitsurugi cards. And then once the new Blue Eye structure comes out, we'll get to talk about the new Primite stuff. But for the time being, we got some of the same old. This is Fiendsmith. It's nothing new. It's basically just the Fiendsmith engine giving you all the good advantages that the Fiendsmith engine does, plus a ton of hand traps and good engines, whether that's the Kashtira engine for, extra interruptions with Fenrir, or extra deck removal with Unicorn that can be really powerful, whether it's a ton of hand traps that just, shut your opponent out of the game because you really only need like one card combos in order to get going in Fiendsmith, whether that's teching in some of the magical muskets because they're light fiends and act as one card combos that bridge you into Fiendsmith. This deck kind of is built around the concept that we're going to do one thing, we're going to do it really well, and then it's going to take so little resources that we're going to be able to beat you with all these other advantage generating cards. And it's effective. It's a pretty effective list. Fiendsmith is very strong. It's being splashed in almost everything. So being splashed in its own deck also kind of makes a lot of sense. This to me is a very interesting list because it looks like almost a Dragon Link combo deck that revolves around the Fiendsmith cards. I mean, there's not much actual Dragon Link stuff in it, but they just use all of the good Dragon monsters as extra Link fodder to make stuff like the Sequence and other stuff more consistently. You can make M7, you can make Wave King Caesar. Very interesting. This is not a brew I would have thought would be working, but that's a pretty interesting way to play Fiendsmith, all things considered. But again, we're not going to spend too much time on Fiendsmith. We talked about it before. A deck that's more interesting and we haven't seen on a lot of folks' radar until recently again is Memento. Memento is a deck that got some good support a couple sets back, but hasn't really been touched in recent sets. But has always kind of been huddling under the surface, waiting for its chance to jump up and take its spot as a tier 2, tier 3 threat in the metagame. Because it does a lot of really strong things. We can see they're on, again, we've talked about all of these cards in detail in a previous meta snapshot, so we won't go over all of their effects individually. But I think the coolest innovation is playing the new Goblin Biker Grand Breakout. I know previously they were on Goblin Biker Grand Entrance as well, I believe. The other continuous spell that searches, or it's not continuous spell, it's a normal spell that searches any goblin, but now they can use Grand Breakout as a way to just summon their goblin from deck, because Memento Goblin is most certainly a goblin monster, which is funny to me. With to no one's surprise, there are also some variants that are playing the Fiendsmith engine. Because this deck does generate a solid amount of bodies on board, it's very easy to translate those bodies into Fiendsmith because nothing really locks you in this deck. If we take a look at a recent topping list, we can see that this is a more pure variant of the list that has a lot of going second cards in it, which is interesting. Main decking Book of Eclipse and Droplet and Metaltronus in favor of more hand traps might be a good idea given how strong a lot of the top decks are against hand traps. Really hard to play through them. Additionally, because you have access to a number of level 4s in this deck, you can make good use of Ryzeal Detonator as well, with either your Acheron or any of your Dark Blades. It's not too hard to get level 4s on board with that, so Detonator can be a nice part of your end board. And it's just there just seems to be some good stuff. Memento does one thing very well, sets up their big guy, gets a decent number of pops. They can play the Cranium Burst as an additional tech in the side deck if they know they're going first. But in general, they just generate a decent amount of advantage while also breaking boards with pop effects, which is pretty cool. And this one is on the Grand Entrance I was talking about, which is the Goblin Searcher. So not completely out of lists yet. But yeah, that was a Memento. We brushed through it pretty quickly, but again, we've talked over all the cards before, and while a cool deck is not necessarily taking up a large percentage of tops, again, like the top 2 decks already take up 75% of the format, and the other rest of like 85 is with like Tenpai Fiendsmith stuff. So realistically, these decks are going to just be seeing a lot less play than these top decks. Voiceless Voice is just the one that happens to be in this 7th slot, so we will talk about it here. But again, not a deck I expect to see too much in terms of tournament success. Although it's a deck that's like escaped every ban list it's been exposed to. I mean, nothing's touched Voiceless Voice. It still has some very strong combos and potential. I mean, Skull Guardian's still a very strong Omni Negate. Saravis is still a really strong Summon Negate on board. And you can do some fun shenanigans with like Truris Hierarchica combined with Diviner of the Herald in order to get into your low very consistently, which is really, really cool, all while searching one of your rituals. They just all synergize extremely well together. That being said, the power level's just not quite there. Still folds to 1 or 2 hand traps, still has its boards broken by a lot of the top decks, and a deck that is relying on having continuous spells and traps stay face up on the field and resolve to get their effects off is not going to survive in a world that's dominated by Ryzeal Detonator, who can just absolutely invalidate a large portion of the Voiceless Voice advantage generating cards. But again, you can easily win games, matches, your locals, even probably some regionals with Voiceless Voice. It's still a competent deck if piloted by someone who also knows the deck very well. As far as ratio goes, you play 3 of your you play 3 copies of all your best cards like Low, Diviner, Barrier, Saphira. You play 2 Skull Guardian because that does come up. The second one does come up relatively often, so you want to play 2. And then there's a lot of 1-ofs in here that are highly searchable, either off of Low or off of your Diviner, and whatnot. And so you can afford to get away with playing one of those, and the rest of the deck is either filled out with like the Deer Servant for advantage or negation by sending like Meteorologic Aggregator. Or you can be playing just a lot more hand traps in order to break your opponent down. If we take a look at this, this is the most recent top. I mean, as you can see, look at the dates on these. It wasn't really topping. It was topping a bit last year, but has been struggling to convert this year so far. It's only got this one top 8 appearance, which again, not bad. Top 8 at a regional is fantastic in terms of a deck's performance. But this is what it's looking like. Again, it's just a lot of hand traps, a lot of powerful 1-ofs alongside the Dogmatica engine and the Herald engine for consistency. The Golden Beast Malong is pretty neat as a way to have a bounce off of either Nadir Servant or Maximus. Pretty cool. But yeah, again, outside of that, we've talked about the Voiceless Voice cards in detail, so nothing crazy to get into here. That's all of the decks that we want to talk about, so let's go ahead and jump on over into the main deck techs. Okay, so moving on, we can take a look at what's popular in the main deck at the moment. As you can see, it's a whole host of various hand traps. We've got Imperm seeing a lot of success at the moment. It's been the top dog the past like 8 or 9 times we've talked about it, and it's no surprise to me that it holds that spot. Imperm, especially a choice Imperm against like Ryzeal on the duo drive, or against Maliss if you suspect they're on few like bodies, like hitting any of their like advantage generating cards can end their turn sometimes. So Imperm, definitely super impactful. Doesn't turn on any of your talents, again, which we'll talk about. Very, very strong. Ash, no real reason to talk about why Ash is so good. Again, it's stopping summoning from deck, searching. Every deck's doing that now. It feels good. Stops the mulch armies. Just an overall fantastic card. The Bestials, both Magma and Jerusalem, are seeing a lot of play. I'll attribute that partially to Maliss, who are all main decking the Bestials because of how well they synergize with their own cards. But additionally, with all the Fiendsmith rolling around, the Bestials are certainly not bad by any stretch against the Fiendsmith stuff. So playing Bestials, I wouldn't say is a mistake necessarily, but it does feel awkward if you're not on Maliss, because if you run into the Maliss matchup, it feels really bad to have them. You're essentially just giving your opponent free advantage. So maybe if you're not on Maliss, I put these in the side deck, but main deck feels decent too. I mean, it's kind of hard to go wrong with the Bestials. They're just very, very strong. Talents, seeing a solid amount of play with the prominence of hand traps, the mulch armies, Ashes, Bestial's Talents is going to be live more often than not a lot of the time. Having a way to sculpt your opponent's hand or draw extra cards when you're in a pinch is very, very nice. Just an overall solid card that I expect to see solid play for the remainder of its legality. And I don't expect its legality to go anywhere, to be fair. But definitely a very strong card. Nibiru is seeing a ton of play with Maliss around. Maliss struggles into Nibiru and can be shut down with a single Nibiru. The Fiendsmith Ryzeal deck, if they don't respect Nibiru and don't go for the Highway of King Caesar line, can also get blown out by a Nibiru. You have to do it before they put up the field spell is important to remember, because the field spell can negate the Nibiru, but normally they've summoned 5 times by that point. Well, that's not necessarily true, but they definitely can get caught in scenarios where Nibiru is good. It's a lot worse in the Ryzeal is what I'll say. Because of the Fiendsmith, because of the field spell, Nibiru doesn't feel as great, but it's still so good into Maliss that it feels like it's a fine card to justify playing. Veiler is imperm at home. It's basically the same thing in terms of why people are playing it. Only downsides are that it has opponent's turn only and a monster, but still a very strong card. Fuelos, this was a card I was hating on in terms of I thought that Perulia was better, but it seems like tournament results. I think Perulia is better in this format, but tournament results are showing Fuelos still extremely strong card. Still obviously very good into Maliss, still obviously very good into Ryzeal, into Fiendsmith. Tons of decks are summoning from the deck and the extra deck, so you'll get a ton of draws off your Fuelos going second, and main decking it when you have that much upside in the scenarios where you go second feels like a good idea. Fiendsmith in Paradise. About 50% of decks are playing Fiendsmith in Paradise, which is crazy. That means that not only are 50% of decks playing the Fiendsmith engine, but they're playing the heavier Fiendsmith engine. There's a lighter variant where you can just play the Engraver and the Lacrima in order to get access to a lot of the good Fiendsmith extra deck tools, but the Paradise is really played in the larger package where you're on multiple copies of Engraver and you're on the Lacrima, probably on the Lurie and the Tract, and then the Paradise is in there to be dumped off the Lacrima. You can throw it in there with the Engraver Lacrima stuff, but this feels just like a sign of how prevalent Fiendsmith is. Being in 50% of decks is absolutely nuts, and it's definitely in more than 50% of decks due to the fact that Paradise isn't even played in all of the different Fiendsmith piles. And then Call by the Grave's in here as well. Again, I'm surprised this isn't seeing more play given how prevalent all of these hand traps are. Being able to call by the Grave of Fuelos or an Ash or hitting a Veiler can be important to keep your plays going. I guess a lot of the top decks are already pretty hand trap resilient naturally, and so they don't feel like they need the Call by the Grave necessarily. But it still feels pretty impactful to me, so I expect that to be around a solid amount. In the side deck, we can see the number one choice in 98% of deck lists is Artifact Lancia. Lancia is incredibly good into the Maliss matchup, basically a game winner against them. And it's opponent's turn only, meaning that even if you're on Maliss, you can play Lancia and shut your opponent out of the game, even if you have some banish effects you normally like. Like, Lancia just invalidates all of what Maliss does, and it feels so bad to just... It feels so bad for them that it's hard to justify not playing. And 98% of people agree. Like, just play Lancia in your side deck at the moment. This format, Lancia is crazy. Dimensional Barrier. Kind of the same thing, but for Ryzeal. If they're on Ryzeal Fiendsmith, this hurts a lot less because they can go into their Link and Fusion plays. But at the very least, Dimensional Barrier is a strong card. It keeps them off their Detonator, which is one of the scariest parts of their end board. And can absolutely shut out other rogue options like Voiceless Voice, like we looked at, like Memento, like Tenpai. Again, this card is kind of just a catch-all. It's really only bad into Maliss, and even so, you have your Lancias in your side deck for Maliss that are the equivalent shutdown. So playing these two in tandem feels like it covers a large portion of the metagame. Feather Duster is here, as it almost always is, given the fact that just having a card that can invalidate trap back row decks feels really strong. In case you ever run into any jank or cheese, having this going second almost never feels bad. Even if it's just trading 1-for-1 or 2-for-1, clearing your opponent's spell and traps can feel very nice. Thrust is in here as a way to not only search Dimensional Barrier to deal with Ryzeal It also can search Sanctum to deal with Maliss. It can search Ultimate Slayer if you're going second in order to deal with the Detonator. Just an overall really strong card. There are a number of options you can be choosing to play with Thrust that aren't represented here. That could be like different Dimension Ground if you're afraid of the Graveyard. That can be Spell Cancel. I don't think it's Spell Canceller. It's Magic Deflector if you're afraid of like Field Spell or Quick Play Spell decks. Like if you see a lot of Runic still at your locals or something like that. It's just a hyper flexible card that can play into a lot of different matchups. Searches both of the blowouts against the two top decks, so expect Thrust to see a solid amount of side deck play. Ultimate Slayer is in here because it's a great out to Ryzeal Detonator. That Detonator can't be destroyed, so sending it back to the extra deck is a great way to get rid of it, and it additionally doesn't put it in the graveyard, so they can't take advantage of the Eclipse Twins to just summon it back. Really, really nice, especially with Eclipse Twins floating around. I expect this to go up in play. Solemn Strike's in here. I guess we'll skip around a little bit. Call by the way we already talked about in the main deck. Looks like this is where the other 30-some% of people put it instead of in the main deck. They have it in the side deck. To me, this should go in the main deck in my opinion, but if you feel like it's only highly situational, the side deck is a nice spot for it as well. Aurelia is in here because of, I think this format is very, very strong. Against Ryzeal, you're getting multiple draws off of it. Against Maliss, you're getting quite a handful of draws with the Maliss monsters and the Bystials and whatnot. So Aurelia gives you a solid amount of resources against the top two decks. Feels like a pretty automatic inclusion, in my opinion, in a lot of side decks. Looks like the percentages aren't necessarily agreeing with me. And so tournament results obviously take precedent over my own biases, but Aurelia is still a very strong card. Don't overlook it and don't forget that it exists. We talked about Sanctum with Thrust. Solemn Strike, I got excited about it because I saw it. It's been so long since we've seen Strike see such usage, but it's back and better than ever. Turns out being able to negate any monster effect or any special summon from the extra deck in a format where that's happening constantly and at spell speed 4 or 3, not 4. Spell speed 3, but still basically unrespondable to 2, especially when you're going first and your opponent's going second. Can make the difference in a lot of matchups. A well-timed strike can just shut down your opponent's combos, keeps them off a lot of their resources, and makes a lot of sense. It also insulates your own board against certain monster board breakers that could be coming out as well. So makes a lot of sense as a going first inclusion in the side deck. And then Crossfire Designator's in here because so many decks are on so many hand traps that this can almost be a free inclusion in the side without actually committing any sort of other sideboard resources to it. If you're on Maliss and you want to stop Lancia, Crossfire Designator can stop it. Similarly, Dimensional Barrier for stuff like Tenpai or Ryzeal, Crossfire Designator can stop it. Crossfire Designator also just synergizes with the fact that so many people are on so many hand traps in the main deck, so because you're already likely playing the Imperm and the Ashes, you can turn off your opponent's Imperm and Ash against you if those would hit an impactful card. Just overall a really nice piece of the side deck. But yeah, with that, we've taken a look at the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta as it stands right now. Those are some of the top decks. We went over about 90% of the meta game, so you can easily expect a large portion of your tournaments to be populated with these decks. If you felt like I missed any decks, or there are any specific decks you want me to talk about in future meta snapshots, go ahead and let me know down in the comments below. Additionally, if you want to talk about any of my discussion topics, if I got anything wrong, or if there's ways you think I can improve the video, also let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear those thoughts and get that feedback from you all. If you like this kind of content, I make it bi-weekly, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next edition of Meta Snapshot. And I've got plenty of other older Meta Snapshots if you're looking to take a look back into Yu-Gi-Oh's history and take a peek at what we've had at previous snapshot points in over the past year or so. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!